October 23, 1961, 14:47 Moscow time. Forester Petr Ivanovich Kovalev was walking along a familiar path 20 kilometers from Irkutsk when he came across something that shouldn't be there. Among the familiar pines and birches, between two overgrown ravines, a metal hatch was sticking out of the ground. Brand new, shiny, as if it had just been installed yesterday. But Kovalev had been walking around these places every week for 15 years now, and there had never been any hatch here. He squatted down and brushed fallen leaves off the metal surface. On the hatch cover was an inscription in Cyrillic, Aurora, 17. Entry strictly with passes. Below was the USSR coat of arms and the date, 1975. Kovalev rubbed his eyes and read it again. 1975? But it was only 1961. His hands shook as he tried to turn the massive wheel. The hatch gave way easily, as if the mechanism had been recently oiled. Inside, a gaping metal shaft with a ladder leading down yawned. Warm air blew from below and smelled of electricity in action. A light flickered in the depths. Kovalev was a simple forester, but he was no coward. The war had taught him not to be afraid of the unknown. He took out a flashlight and began to descend. 20 steps. 40. On the 50th step, he found himself in a corridor whose walls were lined with white tiles. Pipes and electric cables ran along the ceiling. Fluorescent lamps burned with an even, cold light. "What the hell?" the forester muttered, but curiosity was stronger than fear. He walked down the corridor, listening to the silence. Only the hum of the ventilation and the quiet crackle of electricity. No voices, no footsteps. But the feeling that people had recently been here hung in the air like a thick fog. The first door he opened turned out to be an office. A polished wood desk, a leather chair, and a portrait of Brezhnev on the wall. Kovalev stopped dead in his tracks. Brezhnev? But Comrade Khrushchev was still in power. On the desk lay a folder marked "Top Secret" and next to it a calendar. The date on the calendar made the forester clutch his heart, December 15, 1975. It was impossible. Absurd. But the documents in the folder were real, with real seals. Report on the completion of the Time Bridge experiment, the title read. The project to create an underground base using time-shifting technologies has demonstrated complete efficiency. The Aurora 17 facility is functioning autonomously. Kovalev read and couldn't believe his eyes. The report spoke of a group of Soviet scientists who began a secret experiment in 1958. They found a way to send material objects into the future, not physically, but somehow differently. They created objects that began to exist before they were built. The object materializes in the past from the future, the forester read, feeling a chill run down his spine. The bunker exists in 1961 because it will be built in 1975. The paradox is stabilized by an artificial time loop. The base personnel work in two time periods simultaneously. The next door led into a laboratory. There was equipment here that Kovalev had never seen before, machines with lots of flashing lights, screens showing incomprehensible graphs, devices with dials in unknown languages. On one of the tables lay a notebook with notes. The handwriting was illegible, nervous. October 17, 1975. The experiment was a success beyond all expectations. We not only moved the object in time, we created a stable time anomaly. The bunker exists in all time periods simultaneously. But there is a side effect. The people working here begin to change. They see events from different eras. Ivanov claims to have seen the fall of the Berlin Wall. Petrova talks about the collapse of the USSR. This is nonsense, of course, but... The entry broke off mid-sentence. The rest of the pages were blank. Kovalev walked from room to room, and each new discovery was stranger than the last. A bedroom with beds still warm from the recent presence of people. A dining room with the remains of food on the plates, borscht that had not yet cooled down. A command post with maps on which were marked cities whose names the forester had never heard. In the last room, the archive, he found something that made him collapse in a chair in horror. Folders with documents dated in different years, 1965, 1970, 1980, 1985. Photographs of people in unfamiliar uniforms, with shoulder straps of an unknown design. Newspaper clippings with headlines: Gorbachev elected General Secretary, accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the Berlin Wall has fallen. And in the midst of all this, his own photograph. Pyotr Ivanovich Kovalev, but aged by 20 years. In the hands of the old Kovalev was a sign with the inscription, custodian of the Aurora 17 facility. 1982 to 1991. The forester sat in the absolute silence of the bunker and tried to comprehend the impossible. This bunker was built in the future, but existed in the present. The people who worked here saw events that had not yet happened. And he himself, judging by the photo, would also become part of this history. Suddenly, footsteps were heard in the corridor. Slow, measured. Kovalev froze, listening. The steps were getting closer. He grabbed a lantern from the table and looked out into the corridor. A man in a white coat was walking towards him. His face was calm, but his eyes looked as if from another time. Pyotr Ivanovich, said the stranger, and his voice was strangely familiar. We were waiting for you. We knew you would come today. This is recorded in the Chronicles of 1978. Who are you? The forester croaked. I am Dr. Semenov, the head of the Time Bridge project. Or rather, I was the head. Or will be. Time flows in a special way here, Pyotr Ivanovich. The past, present and future exist simultaneously. Semenov came closer. Now Kovalev saw that the scientist's clothes changed periodically, sometimes a white coat from the 1960s, sometimes a gray suit of a later cut, sometimes a uniform of an unknown purpose. What's going on here? Asked the forester. We made a mistake, Pyotr Ivanovich. We tried to create a perfect shelter, a bunker that would exist forever, in all times. And we succeeded. We succeeded too well. Now we see the whole history at once. We know what will happen to our country, to the world. And we can't change anything. Why am I here? Because it has to be that way. You will find this bunker, you will become its caretaker. You will make sure that no one breaks the time loop. In 1982, you will officially receive this position. And in 1991. Semenov fell silent. What in 1991? Then the loop will close. The USSR will cease to exist, and with it the need for secret bunkers will disappear. Aurora 17 will dissolve in time, like the rest of us. Kovalev felt reality coming apart at the seams. He looked at a scientist who existed in several times at once, standing in a bunker built from the future, holding a photograph of his aged face. Do I have a choice? He asked. There is always a choice, Semenov answered. You can leave here, forget everything you've seen. But then in 1975, when the bunker is actually built, there will be a time collapse. Or you can stay, accept your role. Become a bridge between times. An alarm sounded in the corridor. The red lights began to flash in unison. What is this? Temporal instability, Semenov explained calmly. Your presence here is creating fluctuations. The system is trying to determine what time we are in. We need to make a decision quickly. Kovalev looked at the hatch he had come down through. Up there was his familiar world. The forest, the trails, the simple work of a forester. But also a lie. Because now he knew the truth about the future, he knew that their country was living out its last decades, he knew about the catastrophes and changes that would come. If I stay, will I be able to prevent what I saw in the documents? No. Time cannot be changed, it can only be observed. You will become a witness of history, but not its creator. The alarm grew louder. The bunker walls began to shake. Time is running out, Pyotr Ivanovich. The loop must close. The forester closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he saw himself in the mirror on the wall. But the reflection was different, older, in an unfamiliar uniform. With the shoulder straps of a caretaker of a secret facility. I'm staying, he said, and his voice sounded like an echo from the future. The alarm went silent. The red lights stopped flashing. The bunker was silent, full of anticipation and mystery. And in the forest, above, the hatch closed, which no one would find again until 1975. Until the time when it would be built and forgotten at the same time. Kovalev became the first caretaker of Aurora, 17, a man who will live in two times at once, guarding a secret that exists in defiance of all the laws of nature. On October 24, 1961, KGB Colonel Sidov met Dawn in a place that didn't exist on any map. The air in the Aurora, 17 bunker was sterile, with a distinct smell of ozone and cold steel that irritated the throat. The hum emanating from the walls was not just a sound, it was felt more in the diaphragm than in the ears, a low-frequency vibration, as if the heart of a giant, sleeping machine was beating underfoot. Together with Sidov in the bunker was his task force, the young, energetic Lieutenant Varnin, whose eyes were ablaze with a mixture of fear and professional curiosity, and the captain of the engineering troops Petrov, a sullen, taciturn specialist in fortifications, who, after the first inspection of the entrance, merely shook his head and said, "We won't have such alloys for another 20 years, Comrade Colonel." The forester Kovalev, who found the object, was sent to Irkutsk under strict surveillance. His official version for his superiors was nervous exhaustion due to overwork. But Sidov knew that the old man saw the same thing he did, a future that had mistakenly sprouted in the present. "We begin a systematic survey," Sidov ordered, his voice booming along the white corridor. "Level by level. Petrov, you are responsible for the technical analysis. Varnin, your task is documentation. Record everything, inscriptions, numbers, layout. I am in overall charge. Contact the surface every 30 minutes. If we do not make contact within an hour, the evacuation team will blow up the entrance." Petrov nodded, taking a set of tools from his toolbox, which looked like museum pieces against the smooth walls of the bunker. Varnin opened his field notebook. Their heavy tarpaulin boots seemed out of place on the flawlessly smooth, seamless floor, made of a material similar to polished stone. They began their descent. The flights of stairs led 12 levels deep into the Siberian soil. Each level was sterilely clean, without a speck of dust. Automatic doors, sensitive to movement, silently slid apart, opening access to new rooms. German trophies? A secret development? Varnin tried to find a rational explanation. Too clean for trophies, and too perfect for our developments, Petrov snapped, running his hand along the wall. This isn't concrete. And not steel. Something composite. Light, but stronger than armor. On the -3rd level they found the living quarters. The rooms were austere but comfortable. Beds, tables, cabinets, everything was made of the same light, warm to the touch material. Clothes hung in the cabinets, simple overalls made of a fabric none of them had ever seen. It was thin as silk, but did not tear or wrinkle. On one of the tables lay an object that looked like a book, but without pages, a thin glass plate. When Varnin touched it, lines of text flashed on the surface. He pulled his hand back as if from fire. "What is this, Comrade Colonel?" Sidov came closer. The text on the screen was in Russian, but it was full of unfamiliar terms: quantum entanglement, chronosynclastic infundibulum, Mobius loop stabilization. This was not the physics of 1961. This was magic. The medical bay was located on the -5th level. The same unearthly order reigned here. In glass cabinets stood ampoules with drugs, the names of which meant nothing to them. On the operating table lay surgical instruments, more like jewelry. But the main shock was the machine in the corner of the room. It resembled an X-ray machine, but it was connected to a screen that displayed a three-dimensional model of the human skeleton in real time. Petrov approached the machine, and his own bone structure immediately appeared on the screen with all the details, right down to the old fracture of the collarbone. "A diagnostic scanner," whispered the doctor from Sidov's group, who remained on the surface, when the device was described to him over the radio. "Theoretically, it's possible, but it requires computing power that we won't have for another 30 years. On the -7th level they found an archive. It was a huge room filled with shelves. But not with folders, but with some metal cassettes. In the center stood a table with a device for reading them. Sidov randomly took one of the cassettes and inserted it into the slot. An image appeared on a large screen built into the wall. It was a document. The minutes of a meeting. At the top was the stamp, Ministry of Electronic Industry of the USSR. And the date, March 17, 1978. "This ministry does not yet exist," Varnin said quietly. Sidov silently read the text. It spoke of completion of the first stage of colonization of Mars, and problems with terraforming Venus. There were signatures under the protocol, familiar and unfamiliar. Academician Keldysh, Tsiolkovsky, which was complete nonsense, and names he had never heard. He inserted another tape. Order of the USSR Space Forces No. 412 of September 5, 1982. On the formation of a patrol fleet for the Jupiter system. Third tape. Scientific report of the Institute of Time. On the risks of creating paradoxes when working with the object Aurora, 17. Sidov felt cold sweat trickle down his back. He, a KGB colonel, a man for whom a document was the highest form of reality, was confronted with an archive that should not exist. It was not a forgery. The paper, the ink, the style of presentation, everything was authentic, but from another time. Finally, they reached the last, 12th level. The command center was located here. A huge round hall, with control panels running along its perimeter. In the center, on a pedestal, was the main computer, not a bulky cabinet like the Strela or Ural one, but an elegant, humming sphere of dark, almost black crystal. The walls of the hall were one continuous panoramic screen, which was now dark. Petrov approached one of the control panels. The power system is operating autonomously. The power source. I can't identify it. It's not nuclear, not thermonuclear. Something else. Efficiency is almost 100%. Suddenly, a calm, slightly mechanical voice echoed through the room. It seemed to come from everywhere. Colonel Sadov. We have been awaiting your arrival. Please proceed to the center of the hall. Sadov pulled out his service Makarov. Varnin and Petrov froze, peering tensely into the shadows. Who is speaking? Sadov asked sharply. Control system of the object, Aurora, 17. We have recorded your presence on the -1st level. Further advancement has been authorized in accordance with the First Contact Protocol. What First Contact? I order you to identify yourselves. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the panoramic screen surrounding the room flared with light. An image appeared on it. It was the same room, but not empty. There were people in it. Dozens of people in the same strange suits they had seen in the living quarters. They were sitting at their consoles, working, talking. The image was not a recording, it was alive. Sadov felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. This was not a newsreel. This was a window. A window into another time. The image on the main sector of the screen changed. Now it showed a close-up of one man. Sadov recognized him immediately. Everyone in the USSR knew that face. Tired, intelligent eyes, a receding hairline, a distinctive head shape. It was Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, chief designer of the Soviet space program. But he was older. 15 years older, with deep wrinkles and gray hair. He was sitting in the same room, at the same control panel, looking straight at Sadov. Hello, Boris Mikhailovich, Korolev said from the screen. His voice was tired but firm. I apologize for this unusual way of introducing ourselves. We don't have much time. Korolev? Sadov couldn't believe his eyes. But how? That Sergei Pavlovich you know is now at Baikonur and preparing to launch another satellite, answered Korolev from the screen. I am him, but from 1978. Sadov felt the floor slipping out from under his feet. He leaned on the control panel to keep from falling. Varnin and Petrov stood there, pale as a sheet. I understand your confusion, Colonel, Korolev continued. It's impossible to believe. But the facts are before you. This bunker, Aurora, 17, was designed and built in the late 70s by a group of Soviet scientists. We found a way not just to travel through time, but to send material objects into the past, creating stable temporal anomalies. He gestured around the room full of people on the screen. All these people are our descendants. And this bunker is their gift. A gift that should save us all from disaster. What catastrophe? Sadov squeezed out. Korolev on the screen became serious. His gaze became heavy, full of pain. The one that will happen in less than a year. In October 1962. Your colleagues from the main intelligence directorate will make a mistake that will lead to a direct nuclear clash between the USSR and the United States. The screen behind him changed. Now it showed newsreels, but of a kind no one had ever seen. Mushroom clouds over Moscow, Washington, Leningrad. Burning ruins of cities. A world plunged into nuclear winter. We lost, Colonel, Korolev said quietly. Everyone lost. Humanity was thrown back into the Stone Age. But a small group of scientists survived. And we spent 16 years trying to find a way to fix everything. The only way. He looked straight at Sadov again. Comrade Colonel, what you see was built in 1978 and sent back to 1961. We are trying to prevent a catastrophe. And we need your help. Colonel Sadov was not breathing. The air in the command center, already thin and smelling of ozone, seemed to have thickened to the density of mercury. The man on the screen, wearing the face of Sergei Pavlovich Korolev but marked by the seal of time and tragedy, looked at him with a look in which hope and endless fatigue were mixed. How is this possible? Sadov finally squeezed out, his voice sounding muffled, as if coming from underground. Temporal anomalies, this goes beyond everything we know. Korolev smiled bitterly on the screen. Science, Colonel, is the art of going beyond the limits. Sometimes, unfortunately, too far. We did not intend to create paradoxes. We were looking for a way to ensure the Soviet Union's eternal prosperity. A source of inexhaustible energy. And we found it. Behind Korolev, the image changed. There was now a laboratory there, but not as sterile as in the bunker. A huge, humming device, like a giant metal coil, was rotating in the center of the room, surrounded by a force field. This was the same chronoreactor. We learned to compress time, Korolev continued. To obtain energy from the future. But it had a price. Each reactor activation created ripples on the fabric of time, instability. We tried to control it by creating anchors in the past. Material objects that would stabilize the flow of time. This bunker, Aurora 17, was supposed to become such an anchor. The most reliable. We sent it to 1961 to create a support, a foundation for our further research. He paused, and his face darkened. We were too arrogant. We thought we could control time like a river, building dams and canals. But time turned out to be an ocean. And we caused a tsunami. The image changed again. Now Sadov saw the familiar faces of the Politburo members, but in an unfamiliar setting, in a command bunker under the Kremlin. The date in the corner of the screen, October 27, 1962. The faces were gray with tension. Khrushchev was shouting at the military, wringing his hands. Because of one of our experiments, Korolev explained, there was a failure in the early warning system. Our intelligence in Turkey received false information about a nuclear strike being prepared by the United States. It was not sabotage. Just a mistake. A technical error, superimposed on monstrous political tension. The screen flashed. American destroyers blockading Cuba. Soviet submarines preparing to launch nuclear-tipped torpedoes. Khrushchev giving the fatal order. And then, silent white flashes that engulfed the screen. That's it, Korolev said quietly. The end. 2 hours were enough to wipe out a 1,000-year-old civilization. Sadov looked at the screen, where there was now only interference, snow, and felt something inside him break. He was a man of the system, a soldier of the Cold War. He believed in the power of his country, in the rightness of his cause. But what he saw was not victory or defeat. It was total, absolute destruction. But if everyone died, then who are you? We are ghosts, Colonel. A group of 200 scientists and engineers who were here in the Aurora at the time of the disaster. The bunker, thanks to its time anomaly, survived the impact. We found ourselves in a pocket of time, isolated from the dying world. We spent 16 years trying to understand what happened and find a way to fix it. And you found it? Only one. Not to return to the past, it's impossible. And, to reach it. Strengthen the Aurora anomaly, turn the bunker from an anchor into a transmitter. Send not people, but knowledge. And find someone in the past who can use it. Korolev looked at Sadov as if he saw right through him. We needed a man with access to the levers of power. A man whose decisions could change the course of events. A patriot, but not a fanatic. Smart enough to understand, and brave enough to act. We calculated thousands of options. And each time the system gave one name. Yours, Boris Mikhailovich. Sadov recoiled from the console. Him? Why him? A simple KGB colonel. Why me? Because in October 1962 you will be the officer who delivers that very false analytical report to the Kremlin. And it is your report that will convince Khrushchev of the need for a preemptive strike. You, without wanting it, will become the trigger for war. The blow was so strong that Sadov staggered. Him? He would cause the destruction of the world? It was monstrous. Unfair. At that moment, the image on the screen changed again. It was an apartment. His apartment in Moscow. His wife, Anna, was laughing, playing with their 5-year-old daughter, Sveta. It was an achingly familiar scene. But then the room flashed white, and everything was gone. Only black shadows remained, burned into the wall. Sadov screamed. It was not the scream of a KGB colonel. It was the scream of a husband and father who had just seen the death of his closest people. We didn't want to show you this, Korolev said sympathetically. But you must understand what's at stake. Not the state, not ideology. But this. He pointed to the blank screen. Life. Sadov collapsed into a chair, covering his face with his hands. His world, the world of orders, regulations and state security, had just crumbled to dust. What difference did it make who was right, the USSR or the USA, if in the end there would be no one left? What should I do? He whispered. We will give you precise instructions. A list of actions. Insignificant at first glance. Lose one document. Delay the transfer of another. Recommend transferring one general to the Far East a week before the crisis. Each action is like a small push that will change the trajectory of the falling stone. Together, they will avert the threat. But this is betrayal. Sadov raised his head. There was agony in his eyes. Breaking the oath. High treason. What will you defend, Colonel? Asked Korolev. A state that will burn in a nuclear fire along with the rest of the world? Or a state that will have a chance for a future? Suddenly, Sadov felt a sharp migraine behind his left eye. The air in the room rippled, as if from heat. For a moment, he saw another version of the room, with cracks in the walls and a thick layer of dust on the consoles. And then another. The room was the same, but people in American military uniforms were sitting at the consoles. And then another, with a giant, glowing tree growing in the middle of the room. What is this? He asked, clutching his head. A side effect, Korolev explained. Temporary instability. You are at the intersection of multiple realities. You begin to see echoes of other futures. This will pass as soon as you leave the bunker. Sadov understood. This bunker was not just a building. It was a wound on the body of time. And he stood at its very edge, looking into the abyss. I need to think. There is no time to think, Colonel. The energy to maintain communication between 1961 and 1978 will last for a few more hours. After that, the window will close forever. And the future will become irreversible. Sadov stood up. He walked around the room, touching the smooth, cold surfaces of the consoles. He was a soldier. He had been taught to obey orders, to defend the motherland. And now he was being asked to betray it in order to save it. It was a choice that no academy had prepared him for. Who is running your operation? He asked. Who is the man who has taken responsibility for changing the past? Korolev on the screen looked somewhere to the side. The project curator will contact you personally soon. He wants to make sure you are ready. Korolev's image disappeared. The main screen began to static again. And then, slowly, a new image began to form. An office. Simple, without frills. On the wall was a map of the world, but with different borders. A man sat at the desk. An elderly man, about 60, with gray hair and deep wrinkles around his eyes. He wore a formal jacket, but not a Soviet one. The shoulder straps of a general from some non-existent army. The man raised his head and looked straight at Sadov. And Sadov felt his heart stop. He knew that face. He saw it every morning in the mirror. It was his own face. The face of Boris Mikhailovich Sadov, but 17 years older. "Hello, Boris," said the elderly Sadov from the screen. His voice was tired but determined. "We have little time, and much to discuss. Let's start with you stopping aiming your Makarov at me. After all, you're not going to shoot yourself, are you?" The Makarov seemed alien, a cold piece of metal, in Colonel Sadov's hand. His finger on the trigger tensed white-hot, but his brain refused to give the order. In front of him, on the huge panoramic screen, sat an enemy he could neither understand nor classify. An enemy who wore his own face. "Put the gun away, Boris," the elderly general said on the screen. His voice was calm, unthreatening, but there were echoes of metal and 17 years since the end of the world. "We don't have time for mistrust. The connection is unstable. The power will last an hour at most." Young Sadov did not lower his weapon. His mind, trained by years of service in the KGB to search for deception and provocation, feverishly went through the options. Projection. Hypnosis. Psychotropic influence. Unknown Western technology. Anything but what he saw. "You're not me," he said through clenched teeth. "It's a trick." The general on the screen sighed. There was so much universal fatigue in this sigh that Sadov felt it physically for a moment. "Of course, it's a trick. Like that poem you wrote to Anna on the back of a movie ticket for the film, Spring, in '47. Your eyes are two blue lakes, in which the sky is drowning. You hid it in a volume of Yesenin and never got around to giving it away. You still keep it, right? In a desk drawer, under old photographs." The blow was precise and crushing. The hand with the gun trembled and dropped. No one knew about it. No one in the whole world. Not even Anna. It was his secret, his boyish, intimate stupidity. This man, this ghost, he didn't just wear his face. He owned his memory. "Who are you?" whispered Sadov, collapsing into a chair. "I am you, Boris." 17 years later. 17 years after it all ended. 17 years of life in a world where the only law was the right of the strong, and the only currency was a can of stew and a handful of bullets. I lived through these years, seeing the remnants of humanity squabbling over the ruins, dying of radiation sickness and hunger. I buried Anna. I buried Sveta. I saw how a radioactive swamp was emerging in place of Moscow. And all these years I was looking for a way to return. Not with my body, but with my mind. To stop one single person. Myself. As he spoke, the images flashed on the screen behind him. Not the wide shots of burning cities, but personal, intimate ones. There he was, aged, standing on the ruins of their house on Kutuzovsky. There he was holding their daughter's melted doll in his hands. There he was sitting by the fire with other survivors, ragged, desperate people, in whose eyes there was nothing but emptiness. We, the surviving scientists from Aurora, spent the rest of our lives trying to turn back time. The chronoreactor was damaged, but its core survived. We learned not to send matter, but to project information. To create an information phantom in the past. This bunker you found is not just a building. It is a receiver. A machine that materialized in 1961 using the plans we sent from 1978. But why? Why is everything so complicated? Because you can't just come and say, Comrade Khrushchev, don't press the button. We'd be locked up in a madhouse. You can only change history by acting from within the system. Quietly. Unnoticed. We needed a person who had access to decision-making, but wasn't at the very top. The ideal executor. Someone who, by virtue of his job description, would be in the right place at the right time. And that person was you. General Sadov opened the folder lying in front of him on the screen. Here's the plan. It consists of 7 points. 7 seemingly insignificant actions that you must take over the next year. Sadov read it, and an icy horror gripped him. This was not just an instruction. It was a program of treason. Every action was a carefully calculated act of sabotage, aimed at undermining his country's defenses. I can't do this, he said firmly. It's treason. I took an oath. Oath to what? Steel appeared in the general's voice. To a state that will commit suicide in a year and drag the whole world down with it? To a people that will burn in an atomic flame? Will you be loyal to the dead? There are other ways. Report to the top, convince, provide evidence. The general laughed bitterly. Evidence? What kind of evidence? A story about a bunker from the future? About a talking ghost of yourself on the screen? At best, you'll be forced to resign. At worst, you'll be shot for panicking and anti-Soviet propaganda. I know these people, Boris. I was one of them. They'll believe in a nuclear apocalypse only when it burns out their eyes. He leaned forward, and his face on the screen became larger. Now young Sadov could see every wrinkle, every scar left by time and grief. Understand, we have no choice. This is the only way. We are not destroying the system. We are calibrating it. We are introducing a small error to save the entire mechanism from self-destruction. But the price? What is the price? Will the country's prestige suffer? Will we lose face in a few diplomatic disputes? This is nothing compared to billions of lives. Suddenly the image on the screen flickered, interference appeared, the sound became distorted. The connection is weakening, the general said, his voice becoming urgent. The energy is running out. Boris, listen to me carefully. I know what you are thinking about. About duty, about honor, about the motherland. I thought the same thing myself. But when you see your world turning to ashes, all these words lose their meaning. Only one thing remains. Life. He reached out and touched the inside of the screen. In his palm was an old, faded photograph. It was of Anna and little Sveta. They were smiling, sitting on a bench in Gorky Park. The photo was taken in August 1961. In my time, this photograph does not exist. Neither do they. You have a chance to change everything. To give them a future. To give them life. The image became completely indecipherable. The general silhouette was melting into a snowstorm of interference. I cannot order you, Boris, the last fragment of the phrase reached him. It must be your choice. You choose between loyalty to the ghost of a great empire, and the future of your family, your daughter. The connection was lost. The screen went black. Colonel Sadov was left alone in the huge, humming hall, in the heart of the time machine. He sat, clutching a useless pistol, and stared at the dark screen. The silence was oppressive, filled with unspoken words and the weight of an impossible choice. He was a KGB officer. He was trained to protect the state. But the state is the people. What if you have to betray the state to save the people? He stood up and walked over to the screen. He touched the cold, smooth glass where his older self's hand had just been. In the reflection he saw his face, young, strong, but with a trace of horror and doubt in his eyes. He remembered Anna's face, Sveta's laughter. He remembered the burnt shadows on the wall of their apartment. The world outside this bunker did not yet know that its fate was being decided right now, in this room, by one single man. And this man had to choose who to become, a loyal soldier of a dead empire or a traitor who saved the living world. He walked slowly back to the console. Text was still glowing on one of the small screens. A 7-point plan. A guide to betrayal. Or salvation. He reached out and pressed the Accept Protocol button. The main screen flashed with the following message. Operation Aurora activated. Countdown to loss of communication, 59 minutes 47 seconds. The choice had been made. And now KGB Colonel Boris Sadov was to become his own country's most dangerous enemy. And its only savior. The world outside the Aurora 17 bunker had not changed. When Colonel Sadov and his group rose to the surface, they were met by the same cold, damp Siberian autumn. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth. But for Sadov himself, the world would never be the same. He had returned not just from a secret facility, he had returned from the future. And this knowledge, invisible and intangible, lay on his shoulders with a weight comparable to the weight of the earth itself. The official report he compiled was a masterpiece of bureaucratic balancing act. Object Aurora 17 is an abandoned experimental mine of pre-war construction, presumably of German design. Traces of high-tech equipment of unknown origin, probably captured, have been discovered. The object has no strategic value, but contains unstable chemical reagents. Complete conservation and classification of the area is recommended. It was a lie. A perfect, carefully crafted lie that was meant to bury the truth for decades. Moscow accepted the report. The bunker was sealed, the entrance filled with concrete and camouflaged. Forester Kovalev was sent to a sanatorium with a diagnosis of acute fatigue and was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement. The members of Sedov's group were scattered among different garrisons. The Aurora 17 case was placed in the farthest drawer of the archive, marked, "Keep Forever." For everyone except Sedov, the story was over. For him, it was just beginning. Back in Moscow, he felt like a stranger in his own world. He looked at the people on the streets, at his colleagues in the Lubyanka building, at his wife and daughter, and saw not just people, but living ghosts, walking toward a fate they had never even suspected. On his wrist, under the sleeve of his jacket, there was now something that would forever separate him from them. The chronometer, a device that looked like an ordinary watch, a gift from his older self. It did not tell the time. It told probabilities. Probabilities of key events. Now the main scale, marked with a red line, read, probability of a global nuclear conflict within 12 months, 93%. The first point of the plan. November 15, 1961. Sedov had to accidentally ruin the report of Agent Sokol. He had been preparing for this day for 2 weeks. It seemed simple, almost funny. But when he entered the office of the 3rd GRU department with a cup of hot, sweet coffee in his hand, his palms began to sweat. He, a KGB colonel, a master of interrogations and operational combinations, felt like an inexperienced saboteur. The head of the department, Colonel Gromyko, placed that very folder on the table in front of him. Here, Boris Mikhailovich, is a fresh analysis of the American Polaris. Our hawks in the general staff will be pleased. The agent confirms their readiness for the first strike. Sedov took the folder. His heart was pounding so hard that it seemed Gromyko must have heard it. He pretended to read, but was actually looking for the right moment. The moment came when Gromyko turned to the safe. Sedov accidentally waved his hand. Coffee spilled on the pages, turning the secret data into a blurry brown spot. Damn it! Gromyko cursed, turning around. My apologies, Comrade Colonel, Sedov muttered, confused, feigning awkwardness. I was lost in thought. His hand trembled. He thought. Gromyko was furious, but what could he do? Accuse the colonel from the adjacent department of deliberate damage? Bring the typist here. Quickly. Retype everything by morning. The report was retyped. But the hurried typist, working at night, made several accidental typos. There were mistakes in the submarine basing coordinates. The word inevitable disappeared from the conclusions before the word threat. Little things. But it was from such little things that the big story was made up. That evening, Sedov looked at his chronometer. The probability of conflict had fallen. 93% had become 89%. He had saved the world by 4%. And he felt like the last traitor. The following months turned into a series of such accidents. He lived a double life. During the day, he was a model KGB officer, a loyal servant of the system. At night, he was a secret saboteur, undermining it from within. He began to suffer from insomnia and became irritable. Anna, his wife, looked at him with concern. Boria, what's wrong with you? You're not yourself. Maybe we should go on vacation? He couldn't explain anything to her. How to tell her that you can't sleep because you see Moscow burning in your dreams? How to explain that you can't relax because the fate of the world rests on your shoulders? The mystical ability that Korolev had warned about also began to manifest itself. Sedov began to see probability lines. Walking along the corridor of the Lubyanka, he saw possible futures next to his colleagues. Here is Major Ivanov, in one version, he gets a promotion, in another, he is arrested a year later. Here is the young secretary Lena, in one line, she marries a diplomat and leaves for Paris, in another, she dies in a car accident. The world ceased to be unitary and definite for him. It turned into a tangle of intertwined destinies, and Sadov felt like a spider in the center of this web, whose every movement changed the pattern. It was October 1962. The atmosphere in Moscow was tense. Newspapers were full of headlines about American provocateurs and the imperialist threat. Patriotic marches were broadcast on the radio. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. Sadov looked at his chronometer every hour. The numbers inexorably crept up. 89%. 91%. 94%. His minor sabotage delayed the inevitable, but could not prevent it. The flywheel of war was spinning on its own. October 26. The most tense day of the crisis. Sadov was urgently summoned to see Army General Zakharov, the chief of the General Staff. The top ranks of the army and the KGB were sitting in an office that smelled of expensive tobacco and anxiety. "Comrade Colonel," said Zakharov, without raising his head from the map. "We have just received information through closed channels from our residency in Washington. President Kennedy has given a secret order to begin a full-scale military operation against Cuba in 24 hours. This means war." Sadov went cold. He knew it was a lie. Point 5 of his plan was that on that very day, the double agent would transmit disinformation to provoke the USSR into a first strike. "Is the source reliable?" he asked, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "More than that," Zakharov snapped. "Comrade Khrushchev is waiting for our final analytical conclusion. We have an hour to prepare a file for him. Your task, Colonel, is to personally deliver it to the Kremlin." They handed him a red folder with the USSR coat of arms. Sadov took it. It seemed as heavy as a lead plate. Inside lay a death sentence for the entire world. He walked out of the General Staff building onto the street. A fine, cold rain was falling. Moscow seemed gray and tense. People were hurrying about their business, not knowing that their fate was being decided right now, in the hands of this man in a colonel's greatcoat. He walked toward the Kremlin. Every step sent a pain through his temples. He saw probability lines coming from him. One, bright red, led to the Spazsky Gate. If he followed it, the chronometer would show 100%. The other, dim, almost invisible, led to the side, to the trash can near GUM. He remembered the face of his older self on the screen. "Will you be loyal to the dead?" He remembered the scorched shadows on the wall of his apartment. He stopped at Red Square. There were 100 meters left to the Spasskaya Tower. He looked at his chronometer. 97%. Almost no time left. He made a decision. With a sharp, precise movement, he turned off the path and approached the cast-iron urn. No one saw him, everyone was rushing to take shelter from the rain. He opened the red folder. He took out sheets of paper with text that could destroy the world. For a moment, he froze, feeling the full weight of his betrayal. He was breaking his oath. He was becoming a traitor to the motherland. And then he tore the sheets. Once, twice, 3 times. The tiny shreds of paper flew into the trash can, mixing with the rain and dirt. He did it. He turned and walked away without looking back. He didn't know what awaited him. Tribunal. Execution. Camps. But it didn't matter anymore. He took out the chronometer. The red scale showed a new value. The trembling numbers slowly descended. 97%. 80%. 60%. 45%. They stopped at the 23% mark. The world was saved. But the price of that salvation was known only to him. He walked along the wet cobblestones of Red Square, and for the first time in a year he felt not fear but a strange, bitter relief. He had accomplished his mission. Operation Aurora was over. And now he had to pay the price. But that was a different story. The story of a man who betrayed his country to save his world. Colonel Sadov did not run. He did not try to hide. After the fragments of the secret report, the death sentence for the world, had disappeared into the mud of a Moscow urn, he returned to his office on Lubyanka. He sat down at his desk, poured a glass of cold water from a decanter, and waited. He was prepared for anything: arrest, interrogation under duress in the basements of Lefortovo, a tribunal, and execution for treason. He had violated a direct order at the most critical moment in the country's history. Such things are not forgiven. He waited an hour. 2. No one came. There were no shouts from the office of his boss, General Ryabov. The phone on the desk was silent. This was worse than being arrested. This was uncertainty. In the evening Ryabov summoned him. Sadov entered the office, prepared for the worst. The general was sitting at the table, his face gray and haggard, like a man who had not slept for several days. "Sit down, Boris," he said wearily. "Something happened to that folder that Zakharov gave you. It didn't reach Nikita Sergeyevich. It got lost somewhere between the general staff and the Kremlin." Confusion. Sadov was silent, looking into the general's eyes. Ryabov knew. Or guessed. But he didn't want war either. And he was giving Sadov a chance. A chance that was tantamount to a miracle. According to the latest information, the general continued, looking away, the Americans have also backed down. Kennedy, it seems, has found the strength to stand up to his hawks. The crisis is over. The world can breathe a sigh of relief. Sadov felt the tension that had been holding him all these months release. He had not only saved the world. He had been right. His older self had been right. "I'm glad to hear it, Comrade General." "I'm glad," Ryabov smiled wryly. "But I'm not glad that in my department colonels lose documents of state importance. It's a mess, Sadov. And there should be punishment for the mess." He opened the folder with Sadov's personal file. "Considering your past achievements, we won't send you to court-martial. But you can't stay in your old position either. There's a new position for you. Quiet, calm. Head of the Archives Department of the Central Administration. You'll be fiddling with papers. Swallowing dust. It's an honorable exile, so to speak. Do you agree?" Sadov nodded. He understood everything. He was not shot. He was simply removed. Buried alive under tons of archive files, where he would not be able to influence anything. It was the perfect, Jesuitical revenge of the system he had deceived. Thus began his second life. The life of Colonel Boris Sadov, the keeper of time. He spent the next 17 years in the silence and dust of the KGB's Central Archive. He became its rightful master. During the day, he was a simple bureaucrat, sorting through yellowed files. But at night, when the building was empty, he waged his secret war. A war for the future. Using his access to the state's deepest secrets, he found key points in the past, vulnerable spots where a single action could change the course of history. His weapons were not a gun or poison, but an anonymous letter, a document lost in time, a phone call from a public phone. In 1964, having studied the dossier on Khrushchev's inner circle, he sent an anonymous letter to Politburo member Shelepin with a hint that Nikita Sergeyevich was preparing a new purge of old personnel. This became the last straw that pushed the conspirators into action. Khrushchev was removed. The country avoided a new round of repression. The chronometer on Sadov's wrist showed a drop in the probability of internal conflict from 45% to 12%. In 1968, knowing about the upcoming introduction of troops into Czechoslovakia, he passed information about the plans of the Soviet General Staff to check intelligence through proxies. This did not prevent the Prague Spring, but it allowed large-scale bloodshed to be avoided. The probability of the conflict escalating into a full-scale war in Europe fell from 30% to 5%. He worked like a surgeon, making fine, precise cuts on the body of history. He prevented several local conflicts, helped several talented scientists get funding for their projects, accidentally sent several dissident manuscripts to the West, where they produced the desired effect. He became an invisible gardener, carefully pulling out the weeds and feeding the necessary shoots in the garden of time. But the price was high. He lived in constant solitude, surrounded by a secret he could not share with anyone. He watched his daughter Sveta grow up, his wife Anna grow old, and he loved them with a desperate, piercing tenderness. But he was separated from them by an invisible wall. He could not tell them about his real life. About the fact that his gray hair was not from age, but from the burden of knowledge about wars that did not happen. About the fact that his silence was not from fatigue, but from the impossibility of sharing his main secret. Sometimes at night he would take the chronometer out of the safe and look at its dials. The probability of a nuclear war, the probability of global famine, the probability of an ecological catastrophe. He saw the future as a complex system of equations, and his task was to find the right solution. Finally, the year 1978 arrived. Retired KGB Major General Boris Mikhailovich Sadov, 59, walked into the laboratory of a secret research institute near Novosibirsk. He was no longer the dashing colonel he had been 17 years ago. He was an elderly, tired man with eyes that reflected all the wisdom and all the sorrow in the world. In the center of the room stood it. The chronoreactor. Not the phantom he had seen in the bunker, but the real thing. A gigantic, humming machine, the heart of the Aurora project. Young, talented scientists were bustling around it. Among them was the aged but still energetic Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. They all looked at Sadov with respect and awe. To them, he was more than just a retired general. He was the curator. A man who somehow knew everything in advance. "Everything is ready, Boris Mikhailovich," said Korolev. "There is enough energy for a single impulse. We can send the bunker's information phantom into the past. To October 23, 1961. Sadov nodded. He walked up to the central console. The time loop was about to close. The events of 1961 that had brought him here were now to be created by him. He was both cause and effect. "Go ahead," he said. The reactor hummed. The air in the laboratory began to tremble and ripple. An image appeared on the main screen. The Siberian Taiga. That same clearing. And from underground, from nowhere, the entrance to the bunker began to materialize. Now there was one last thing left. The most important one. Sadov sat down in a chair in front of the camera. This was the same camera through which he would in a few minutes speak to himself, young, scared, doubting. He had to find the right words. Words that would make him believe in the impossible and make the right choice. He looked into the lens, imagining his own face from 17 years ago. "Hello, Boris," he began, and his voice was that of a man who had lived 1,000 lives. "We have little time, and much to discuss. Let's start with you stopping aiming your Makarov at me. After all, you're not going to shoot yourself, are you?" He spoke, and every word was hard-won. He spoke of war, of death, of a world reduced to ashes. He showed the photographs of their family that he had kept all these years as a sacred relic. He did not command. He asked. He begged his past self to make the right choice. When he finished, there were tears in his eyes. He had done all he could. Now the fate of the world was once again in the hands of the young colonel he had once been. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. For the first time in 17 years, he felt at peace. His mission was complete. He had paid his price. He had lived a life of loneliness, but he had given a future to billions. He was not a god, not a judge, not a prophet. He was simply a soldier who had carried out his greatest and most terrible order. And he was also a gardener. A gardener who, risking everything, had planted the seeds of a better future in the rocky, frozen soil of the past. And now he could only hope that those seeds would grow.